Hello, my name is Tim Reilly. I'm a senior principal with LTCI, a marine consultancy located in Rockport, Massachusetts, in the United States on the eastern seaboard. I am happy to speak with you today about offshore wind and the commercial fishing industries and how we optimize coexistence and considerations and strategies and some next steps and lessons learned from that. This topic is of particular interest to me, not only as a practitioner, but as a resident of Massachusetts. You see, Massachusetts is home to two of the largest fishing ports in the United States, the port of Gloucester right next to me, as well as New Bedford. It's also home to the nascent and quickly developing offshore wind industry. So in our small state, we have the combination of both industries trying to coexist in a way that is successful for both of them. I'd like to talk to you about that. So, why is this an issue now? Well, offshore wind in the United States is nascent but growing very fast. This figure shows the quick increase of installed megawatts and cumulative gigawatts of energy through 2030. In fact, in our country, in the United States, we're trying to have 30 gigawatts installed of offshore wind by 2030 and much more towards the middle of the century. I understand from the International Energy Agency that offshore wind will probably be a dominant power source in the EU and UK by 2042. So this is an issue that isn't going away, and in fact creates many structures in the offshore and coastal zone that the fishing industry will have to address and deal with and navigate basically for decades to come. So what are some of the issues? Well, there's a lot of impacts, potential impacts to fishery resources and habitats just by pure virtue of putting monopiles down of offshore wind in fishing areas. There's potential for restrictive access, especially during construction and decommissioning in certain operations of offshore wind, reducing access by fishing vessels. There may be even some set-aside areas potentially. And there's also right now, because this is, at least in the United States, a nascent industry. We are learning lots every month about potential impacts and what to do about them to mitigate and minimize impacts to both fish, other marine resources, and the fishing industry. There's also been historically here a perceived exclusion at times of fishing interests in early planning and operation processes for offshore wind, which leads to some unhappiness by the fishing industry. So we want to try to figure out ways to help these two industries coexist in a way that's productive. So what are some of the potential impacts? Well, there's quite a few potential impacts. There's physical, chemical, and biological, and also some social, economic, and cultural. Here in this figure, we're seeing some physical impacts, for example, of scour for a monopile that has been installed in the seabed. And basically, we have differential erosion around the monopile that can change habitats. We're going to talk more about the specific impacts here in a moment to fisheries, but from a physical perspective, you can have increases in turbidity, so decrease in sunlight. You can have changes hydrodynamics and currents around the monopile, such that it could affect the actual circulation in the water body. For example, here on the eastern seaboard of the United States, we have a mid-Atlantic cold pool that's very productive on the bottom. And we could change that circulation for offshore wind, potentially affecting that productive cold pool. We could have potential for chemical contaminants, again, some turbidity changes. And from a fishery perspective, and this doesn't even take into account the potential collisions for bats, birds, whales, other cetaceans, turtles, that we can have, because we can have change of habitat, we can have change of distribution of fish, we can have impacts to migratory routes for migratory fish species, and a whole other number of potential impacts. So we need to look holistically at what these impacts are through a number of means that we'll talk about. There's also potential for, of course, social, economic, and cultural impacts. If you're closing down part of a fishing ground for a while during construction, that might lead to a loss of income. You could also have some closures that result in increased navigation around the wind farm, which increases operating costs for the fishers. So there are real economic issues too that we will want to address. What are some strategies then with these types of issues? Well, we can have operational strategies such as looking for best practices during construction and operations to reduce impacts. Can involve the fishing industry, again, early input by the fishing industry into siting. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in a moment. Correspondingly with project design and siting, it helps having fishing industry input. Keeping wind farms in places with lesser impact to fisheries is quite important. And when we do see problems, we can apply adaptive management approaches to basically address problems as they come up, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, strategies to protect biodiversity in the seabed and pelagic areas become very important. That will help us improve coexistence. But when we can't reduce to the point of extinguishing impacts, and we have unavoidable impacts, we use mitigation. If we do have impacts to habitats, we can acquire additional habitat, we can restore degraded habitat. And how do we know how much to do that? Well, my company and I have published for offshore wind on quantitative approaches. We call it quantitative mitigation analysis, where we look at the impacts of ecosystem services, both the temporal or time and the spatial components. And we can actually quantify the ecosystem service losses and come up with an equivalent amount, time adjusted, of ecosystem services in terms of mitigation or restoration to compensate and make the public and fishers whole for those losses. We can also, from an operational perspective, provide employment for displaced fishers. For example, running research vessels or safety liaison vessels. When all else fails, there's potential for compensating fishermen for demonstrable economic losses. And an area that we're looking at right now are potential financial arrangements, as we've seen in the Gulf Coast for oil and gas in the North Sea, for abandoned infrastructure, such as offshore infrastructure, that may continue to be an issue. And so looking at financial arrangements for the removal of that kind of abandoned infrastructure could be quite important in the decades to come. Maritime spatial planning, or looking at, from a geographic information system, GIS analysis of where are places that have good amounts of wind for power production, but have less impacts biologically, ecologically, or to the fishing industry. And we can actually designate specific historical or traditional fishing grounds. The European Parliament has made recommendations to that end. Again, have participation and dialogue early by fishers, and also the potential for cooperatively co-designing these offshore platforms to do more than just power production. For example, platforms for weather data collecting to improve weather forecasting. That's one example. So we look for ways to provide additional services as well. And of course, we also look at spatial planning from the perspective of where do we stay away from an ecosystem and biodiversity perspective, for example, important spawning habitats. Some specific strategies that work groups in the European community have suggested are acknowledging the special status of fishers and drawing on their unique local knowledge to help us in siting offshore wind farms. and also setting up a liaison group between the two industries early on to make sure that the communications flow both ways, so we really understand as a whole, ideal locations and less than ideal locations. Additionally, designating specific migratory corridors for both fishermen as well as migratory fish species within wind farms, so that we don't have we have minimized any increase in operational costs for fishers in and around offshore platforms. And support collaborative arrangements between the sectors, so that we can make sure that we have coordinated operations in both sectors. One other thing that is very important on an ongoing basis is monitoring. That is physical, chemical, biological, especially also social and economic monitoring to some extent. This allows for a robust monitoring program, allows for us to really understand where problems are and where they arise. It's critical that this is done in all project phases. We've designed holistic monitoring programs off the mid-Atlantic for offshore wind. And basically, we're talking offshore as well as the entire footprint, where the export cables cross the shoreline, and also onshore for the sensitive habitats onshore too. And covering all phases, pre-construction, construction, operations, and decommissioning. So this really, by understanding holistically what the impacts really are of offshore wind on marine biodiversity and fisheries, it helps us to identify opportunities for adaptive management so that we can minimize, and if not eliminate in some cases, the impacts. There are ongoing initiatives on both sides of the Atlantic. The International Council for the Exploration of the Sea in Europe, and the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance and other groups here in the United States basically work on observing what the impacts are and categorizing those impacts and what the drivers are of those impacts, methods to assess, and observing interactions and lessons learned between the two industries and communicating, and what can we learn going forward. So it kind of helps us to understand a baseline of what the issues are to help us identify solutions in the future. Here in the United States, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance has developed a so-called Fish Forward database that is helpful. It's a compilation, a synthesis of how offshore wind has affected and impacted fisheries, and what the data gaps are, and what the results of ongoing research are, so that helps the public, that helps the fishers, that helps the offshore wind community to understand what some of the issues are. And that database, if appropriately managed, will grow over time and provide us with very good input during planning and operations. For example, some of the studies that have happened and are ongoing, for example, here in the United States, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, it's the group within the Department of the Interior that oversees offshore wind energy development, have done extensive work on electromagnetic fields, habitat mapping, commercial and threatened and endangered species distribution studies. So these kind of baseline and also potential impact studies help us in our planning. There have been a slew of, on both sides of the Atlantic, reef effect studies. For example, here in the UK, there have been lobster studies, as well as in Rhode Island in the United States and New England, that have shown over multiple years of studies that there really hasn't been a signal or an impact on catch of lobsters in the area of wind farms. That's of course very, very good news, and we love to see that the impacts are, there really aren't many impacts from that. But again, that's one parameter, and it's important to look holistically at the physical, chemical, and biological parameters so that we can see basically what potentially is happening almost in real time. And that allows us to then make smart adaptive management to reduce or in some cases extinguish the impacts. So while we've had some very good news recently in both sides of the Atlantic in terms of lobsters and impacts from offshore wind, there's a much bigger story, and looking holistically using monitoring tools will help us be smart going forward. And how do we leverage that? Well, data transparency and sharing is key here. There's so many studies that are being done on both sides of the Atlantic, so many data for monitoring that are being assembled, that it's really critical to have platforms, electronic platforms and repositories for data that are not only are added in some kind of logical way, but are also QA'd and transparent, so that the public, the fisher community, as well as the offshore wind community can really leverage those data when planning offshore wind farms, and also reporting when issues come up so that we can continue to learn. So what lessons have we really learned so far? Coordinate as soon as possible between the fishing and the offshore wind community, early on and ongoing. The communication is just absolutely key here. And when we learn things, we need to share those data in a transparent way via the online data repository platforms. And don't just think, and I'm a biologist myself, but don't just think about the fish biology. Think about what the actual impacts are to the fisheries themselves, because they're not necessarily the same. Certainly related, but not the same. So there are unique issues with both. And involving both communities within permitting will be very helpful, so that that will also streamline permitting, but it also will make it clear and help with the goal of permitting structures that have little impact on the environment and on fisheries. And so to that end, an established science and monitoring plan that is robust will facilitate holistic identification of issues and opportunities for adaptive management solutions. And again, because these are place-based issues, whether you're off the UK, off Denmark, or off of Massachusetts, we have unique issues, place-based issues. So there's really no one-size-fits-all here. So we must be bespoke in our approach. So what's the path forward? Well, we need to consider the lessons learned we just discussed. We need to facilitate fishers' voice in marine spatial planning, other pre-planning efforts, research ongoing, and robust monitoring efforts. We need to share those data and to facilitate management in an open and have an open and targeted dialogue on these issues, and have therefore facilitating good adaptive management and solutions to problems that arise. Thank you very much for your time. I hope to be available for questions, and if for some reason we can't get in touch, my contact information is here, and I always welcome your time. Thank you very much.